Hello, poetry lovers. The video tonight shows the creation of a new poem entitled Things to Teach My Daughter About Grief. Stick around until the end of the video to see the complete first draft of this poem. This poem is the fourth in the series I'm calling Things to Teach My Daughter. You can check out the other poems in this series by clicking the links in the description. I have known since I began working on this series that I needed and wanted to write one poem about grief, but I've just let that awareness kind of percolate in the back of my mind for several months now, turning it over now and then, but always leaving it. I had the sense that I wasn't ready to write it. My time is my most precious resource, and I didn't want to waste any of it on a failed attempt at this poem. Wordsworth believed that poetry arises from emotion recollected in tranquility, and that the best poetry mediates powerful emotion through analysis and contemplation. That hasn't been my experience with this series. On this night, I had an idea for the prevailing image of the poem, and I knew I was ready to write it because I was so shaken and overwhelmed by the idea. I sat down to write, burdened with emotions and striking around for the right words to capture them. And that's where the difficulty started. I had just put my daughter to bed. My husband and my son were still out in the living room next to my office, talking and playing. My son wanted my attention before he went to bed. The kitchen was a mess, and the dishwasher needed to be loaded, and I had the image, but nothing else. So the writing process for this one was kind of a mess. I repeatedly thumbed through my thesaurus, sometimes finding something remotely helpful, but more often just ruling out dead ends. I opened my office door and talked to my husband and son while I was writing. I was living rather than recollecting an emotion, and there was no tranquility to be had. This sense of chaos led to some difficulties in the poem's second half. You can see me hesitate, scratch out the wrong choices, rely lots on my thesaurus. I called out to my husband, who Googled something for me. And then you can see a long pause here. After I wrote these lines, I paused for a full minute. This pause wasn't a moment for analytical consideration. I was crying. As I write the next line, you can see my hand dart upward for a moment as I wiped my eyes so I could keep seeing the page. After that next line, I paused again, aware that I couldn't end the poem there, but honestly uncertain how to move forward. This is where my process is so different from Wordsworth's ideal, and honestly, I think this is where my poetry finds its moments of greatest strength. I have no desire to create pretty poems that impress people with their literary qualities if I cannot also bring readers on a journey from darkness into light, from grief into faith, from despair into redemption. I'm uninterested in tranquility at the expense of power. And in this series, I'm especially focused on helping readers come along on that journey, because these are the actual lessons I hope I can teach my daughter, who I love more than my life, on these themes. So I persevered through the emotion and reached toward a resolution worth considering, even though at the time I didn't know what it was. As I started writing this poem, I imagined that I might arrive at some comforting conclusion. But as I wrapped up, I realized that would be both disingenuous and creatively off base. This poem is not about comfort. It is only about grief. As I wrapped up, I concentrated on the image I started with and restated the opening idea, insisting on remaining in the thick of grief as the prevailing focus of the poem. Maybe someday I'll be ready to write a poem for this series on comfort, but it isn't this one. Here's the rough first draft of Things to Teach My Daughter About Grief, written in about 18 minutes on July 18th, 2023. Things to Teach My Daughter About Grief. You just hold on. It's harder than it sounds. Tonight, moments from settling your sleeping weight on the rainbow sheets, warm from snuggling you to sleep long after wisdom would allow, I found myself drowning in grief again. Not surprised, just so tired. As though grief were an adamant sea, swallowing my resolve in wave after wave, each crest higher than the last, each trough barely enough to gasp one spare lungful of air before the next crushing water wall falls, a swell that tonight spells only never, never again, until I'm gasping, drenched in grief and barely grasping a buoyant board of what? Not hope. Call it love, stunted with loss. I am too tired to swim, the sea too dark to ask if I flounder in a boundless wet, or if yet waves might wash to shore. Wrecked in a fathomless grief, you learn at last to save your strength. You don't try to swim, to plan, to seek land. You breathe. You breathe again. You just hold on. Thanks for watching this episode of Ars Poetica. If you enjoyed watching poetry happen, please like and subscribe. Then go make some art.